2016. I'm just going to jump back and forth a little bit. It will not be in chronological order, but right at the moment, my wife, Linda Anderson, is helping me with recording all of this. She's working at it while I don't do as good at it. But in Indian Hill School, we played a lot of games and enjoyed ourselves. And I can remember during the winter was one year we were enjoying the snow and had been for a couple of days, and I asked my mother, "Hey Mom, can I go to school on skis?" And I was probably 5 years old at this time. And she said, "Yes, you can go to school on skis as long as you go with the big kids," which meant the kids that were maybe up to 2 years older than me. And we used to ski to school, enjoyed it, and enjoyed doing that. And I had my first pair of strap-on skis, which were great things at that time. We could go in a patrol even, skiing to school and skiing back home again. And I'm sure the snow was way deep at that time. I can't remember, but I also began shoveling snow. In a few years, I began shoveling snow for the neighbors. And that was a great thing, particularly when snow was probably 2 feet deep. And it was cold too. From there on, I moved into high school, started out in North High School, and had a fine time there. Got to make and know many friends in North High School, most of which I remember to this day. Not only remember, but I remember their names very well. And I can think of some of them as Carol Morong and Pearl Hurdle and Marilyn Hartz and several others that were in the village there. The village we lived in was a community village, again built by the Norton Company, and my dad would often take me down to his work there at Norton Company, where I was really impressed when he early on took me, he said he was a fireman there. I didn't understand that at the time, but I thought, oh, my dad is a fireman. What that meant was he managed the fires in the big plant kilns where they heated many of the materials that were made into grinding wheels and machinery. One of the things that made a big change and impact on my life was when I was first in college, had gone through about a half year at the University of Maine, when I got a request from the college doctor to come in and see him. So I went in to see him, and he informed me that in a recent test for tuberculosis that had been discovered in me, reported from a testing system they used at that time, that I had tuberculosis and I have to get out of college immediately and to be gone out of the university and the dorm by the next morning, to go home and get investigated for tuberculosis, which was fairly common in those days. So I drove home and went to my parents' home and told them what had been reported, and they had me go in to have it retested again, and sure enough, I was diagnosed with tuberculosis. So that meant I was going to have to leave college and be out on bed rest and drugs for the next year. This was not a very happy message to get, as you might expect. So I went home and I started the bed rest and drug therapy, and went on through that, and eventually got the message that I was going to be able to start up my college life again the following year. But I spent a year at home with that, and I found lots of things to do. I worked in my dad's shop and did a lot of tool use and a lot of making of wood instruments as well as metal. I learned to use metal also at that time, and did a lot of work with using a lot of things that my dad had, grinding equipment particularly. And I did many woodworking things, some of which I still have today. Some candlestick holders out of birch branches that have still here at our home, and we enjoy them at Christmas time. Then from there on, one of the things that we did a lot of metal work, along with some of the things that Paul Rudman started to do, making firearms. I was mentioning about what Ken and Paul and I used to do. We thought we might get into the movie business, so we decided to make a movie of some of our activities with an 8mm camera, because we thought we'd have a lot of fun at it. Also along this line, Ken and Paul and I built a cabin out in Princeton, Massachusetts, which was a three-sided log cabin with called an Adirondack shelter, and we had a great time there. We always took our rifles with us when we were up there, and our folks would leave us off. Either Ken's mother or Paul's mother and Dad would leave us off up there, and we would go camping for a week or longer there, and we had a great time. I remember we shot some small animals, like really ferocious squirrels, we'll say, and we used to eat them around the fire. And porcupines also. We'd make a good meal out of porcupines. And one time we invited up some of the girls that we were going around with at that time. Marilyn Hart, Sigrid England, and Nancy Matson. We had them all up there for a porcupine dinner, and they thought it was pretty good. It surprised us that they did. But from there on, when we got to trying to make a movie, we figured it all out, how we'd do it, which one of us would take the pictures, and go from there. We had I think it was we became one of the gangsters in there that was going to be sneaking up on another person, like Ken Carlson was masked up, to steal from him and take some and surprise him there. And we did just that. And we covered him up with black soot on his face. But then we'd made a bomb out of black powder in a water heater, concrete or a steel water heater, and one of us was dressed up to be the good guy and one was the bad guy, and one of us snuck up on the good guy, and then we switched places and hats and things like that, and then we set off this bomb that we made, and it made a good explosion. We had smoke all over the place up there in Princeton, but it looked pretty interesting for a couple of 15-year-old boys to do, you know? And we didn't get any bad results from it. By the way, I should mention that with my tuberculosis discovery in me, diagnosis I should say, I had no bad effects and was able to return to college after being out for about a year. Went back there, and I joined a fraternity at that time, Lambda Chi, and got to know a lot of boys in the fraternity. One became a good friend of mine, a fellow from Brewer, Maine, Art Allen. I still have contact with Art. There was one thing I can remember: we had discovered an osprey nest not too far from where we lived, and we decided to go down there, and I would climb this pine tree, which was pretty high for my thinking in those days. Got up and settled on the top of it, and I and Art took pictures of the osprey there, which I still enjoy those, because it was quite, the osprey was not happy with me climbing up in this pine tree and getting near his nest, and he would keep making dive bombing raids on me while I was up there. And Art was kind of concerned that I was going to fall out of the tree. Fortunately, that didn't happen. But back to Worcester, when I was growing up as a kid, my mother had me help out in the kitchen quite a bit, doing with cooking, but what I did learn, I learned a lot of Swedish names for things that she was cooking with. Not very good to carry on a conversation with, but jag pratar på svenska lite bit as a pojk. And I'm trying to carry that on in the family. Some of the other things that we did was this cabin that I mentioned. That was a great place to go around in. And Ken and Paul and I had a great time up there. As I mentioned earlier, our parents would take us off maybe 20 miles from home, and they would leave us off and maybe just to be ourselves up there as 15 and 16-year-old boys that just were having a good time. And as I mentioned, we ate a lot of things that at the time I don't think my mother or father would particularly have appreciated it, but we enjoyed it. Some of the things that I also recall was the home I grew up in. Particularly, it was a two-story house built by Norton Company, and it had a stairway going up into it. And then what my father wanted to do was put a bedroom upstairs above the second story, and so he and I worked on that and built it with wood, and did all the finishing work around there, including the plumbing at that time, which later we had to replace a little bit. But in that home, my grandmother, Min Farmor, my father's mother, she lived with us. And whereas I had a room all to myself, growing up there, she was moved into the bedroom that I had been using. So my dad and I built this room for me up on really the third floor, and I had a great time there because I used it for a hobby room, and enjoyed that. But I enjoyed my grandmother being there present in my life, and she helped me also with some of my Swedish, since she had come over from Sweden, from I've forgotten the name of the town, but she did come from Sweden, and they came over in a sailing ship. It took quite a while, but she told me stories about it, seeing whales and things out there which I couldn't imagine at that time. As my farmor, my grandmother, had come over from Sweden, she brought a lot of Swedish ideas and practices from Sweden to bring into our home. And my mother and father both enjoyed Swedish foods. Particularly, I can remember having knäckebröd, which is a hard bread, hardtack it's often called, for many of our meals, and I enjoyed that. We also had lutefisk, lefse. Lutefisk is a codfish that has been cured in lye. I used to help get it washed, so you had to wash out the lye in it over running water, which I did down in the basement of our home. Oh, a lot of pickled herring and sill, which was also in the line of that sort of thing, which I know my wife now does not have a taste for any of the fish that we ate in our home regularly. And I enjoyed it.
Well, you need to tell them how the lutefisk was made.
I just did.
With seagulls pooping on it.
Now, when you're making lutefisk, you don't watch it very close. And one of the things I've learned later on, the codfish is dried on poles, racks along the seacoast. And right there, with the seagulls coming along and dropping whatever seagulls do, and you just wash it out thoroughly, kind of thoroughly before you eat it. But I've enjoyed it in the past, and I enjoy it today, along with pickled herring and
sardines.
Sardines is the other thing that Linda mentions. I eat sardines right now, enjoy them thoroughly. And I'll buy a can regularly and just enjoy anything that's that type of food goes well with me. And Linda does not care for it.
Now he's got a friend, my granddaughter. She loves eating sardines with Carl.
Yeah. I finally found somebody that enjoys them like I do, and that's Linda's granddaughter. Yeah.
Jessica.
Yeah, with Linda's granddaughter Jessica, and her grandson doesn't care for them either. But Linda and Jessica thoroughly enjoys them. One of the things that I'm going to drop back to is my growing up in the childhood and which I lived, and some of the fun stuff we did, particularly. We also built kind of cabins for kids up in the woods there, and I know my mother was always concerned about that. I'd get in trouble someplace up there because I used to take my rifle up regularly, and I'd shoot raccoons up there and bring them home for my mother to fix for dinner. And it took her a while to get used to that, but she enjoyed them after a while. Squirrels, particularly, my mother really enjoyed squirrel, and that was a good thing. I also, when I was trapping muskrats, I'd bring home the muskrats and we'd have them there. My mother would fix them, and then I would skin them and make fur hats out of them, the muskrat hides. And I still have a couple of them. Yeah, they were nice and warm. Now, some other things from my childhood that I would like to drop back to. Lynn, give me some tips.
The neighborhood kids and
Oh,
sledding.
the neighborhood, yeah. Fortunately, Linda remembers a lot of the stories I've told about things growing up, the neighborhood kids and what we did there. Particularly, one of the things we did was I used to tap maple trees and get the maple syrup. And my dad and I would boil that maple sugar or syrup up down in the basement and make maple syrup. And with that we'd put on our pancakes and waffles on a svenskplatter, and enjoyed doing that.
What kind of pancakes?
Svenskplatter.
Swedish pancakes?
Swedish, yeah, that's what it said. I said the Swedish word and forgot what I was doing. That she doesn't necessarily understand any of my Swedish. And so what we did as kids, often in the winter time particularly, was Yeah, you have to for sliding in the snow. We'd have sleds. My folks got me sleds for sliding down the street in front of our house, which was a pretty good little hill. And we had a lot of fun doing that because there'd often be a car coming along, and we'd keep one kid down at the bottom of a hill to let us know that there was a car coming, or letting the car know that the kids were coming down there sliding. Particularly the type of sleds we use, we call runners, and we'd all hitch our sleds together, 5 or 6 sleds together, tie them together with rope, and go down the street swinging back and forth. And that was always a lot of fun. When I was a freshman in high school, why, I got my first, well, I could call it a good job, because I was working 8 hours a day and getting a full 20 cents an hour for that. And when eventually I got a raise, why, it was raised a nickel, and I thought I had the world by the tail at that time. When I was working there, I was working on a farm about 8 miles from where we lived, and I would ride my bicycle there first thing in the morning, and then in the evening ride the bicycle home. And that was a good day for a 15, 16-year-old kid, because the type of work I was doing was digging ditches by hand. And so we'd work all day, and then moved on into weeding. It was a market garden that they had, Mr. Beauregard. He had a market garden, and we would weed at that with a hoe and a rake, and we were working all day and taking a lunch break. Had a good time. There were some nice young girls there that were interesting for me as a young man coming up in high school. Yeah, sure, they were pretty girls. But at any rate, with that going on, I enjoyed it. Coming back from school, there was a long way to go down a good steep hill, and I'd just take my feet off the pedals and let her roll, and that was a lot of fun. I only had one accident that I can remember when I going down a hill with a couple of cars in front of me, and one of them put on the brakes, and I tried to stop, but I couldn't, so I slid under the back end of that car on my bicycle. Made a little bit of a mess out of the bicycle, but it and he survived. Then from there on, I went to, I was still in school. Oh, I remember I started, after the time at Beauregard's farm, I started working at John Higgins Steel Company and Museum. They had a fantastic museum in Worcester on steel armor. It was a big thing with him, and he had gone all over the world collecting things. Well, I worked for them primarily by a Scotsman by the name of Ebenezer Bokup. And Ebenezer had all kinds of stories to get me going. He had quite a life in the English Army over in India, and he could tell stories about that quite prevalently. And Eb just had many things to tell, and I enjoyed them all. He introduced me really to the facts of life, particularly for a young high school boy. So Eb was a good guy. I enjoyed him thoroughly. And he worked later down at the museum, and I'd go down and see Eb working there. And one of the things I picked up down there was working more with steel, and I was impressed with the swords, particularly the swords that were used in the time of the 1500s or something like that. And I decided I was going to make one like that. And sure enough, with my dad's help in his shop, and working there and at the manual training courses that I was taking, why, I built a pretty representative piece of Viking sword, which I still have, and I've taken it to several schools and shown it to them. But that sword was a pretty good piece of work. It's about 34 inches long and double bladed with a brass hilt on it. And I just had a fine time building that and developing my skills in woodworking. So Eb talked with a real Scottish burr. When he'd get out the tucking, why, I'd start to pick up his burr, and I would go along and tell stories just about the same as Eb would do. Enjoyed them. Oh, I'm going to drop back in time again and remember some things from my childhood, but I go back to Ebenezer. He had a lot of sage advice in time. One of his sayings was that he would say, "Yeah, Carl, you just need to remember when somebody comes along and tells you how you could do things better, just remember, any jackass can come along and find fault with something somebody else has already done." Then we look at I took advice on that very much so. And he had a lot of favorite sayings, that, some of which, or most of which, I can't remember offhand, but they'll come back to me as I remember them. So, I can remember back in college, one of the first car that I had, I bought with my dad's help, and he bought it out in the Oxford garage in Oxford, Massachusetts, and it was a 1937 Plymouth sedan, and I thought that was the top of the line. I still have a really good advertising picture of that. And maybe I'll get it out, and before we finish this, I'll show you a picture of that. Then, let's see, some of the other things. Oh, maybe talked about the sword. What? Oh, wood carving. Fortunately, Linda is here with me to give me hints on what to talk about, as if I needed hints on what to talk with. But I picked up carving in early days, and I've always enjoyed carving. And I'll get out some of those carvings too and show them in the day when we get home. Right now, by the way, we are up in
Ocean Shores
in Washington. See, she helps me out. She helps me out at all times when I'm going up, even when I'm talking. But we are up at Ocean Shores enduring about 3 weeks of vacation. What?
1 week.
Oh, 3 weeks here, but 1 week here at Ocean Shores, which is a fine place to be at, just relaxing and enjoying life, and doing some walking and looking at antique stores. I've picked up quite a hobby of enjoying antiques of all sorts, but mostly things of Swedish nature. I enjoy items from Sweden that bring back memories that I haven't even had yet, and that's a fine thing. So we've walked around and looked at some antiques. Another type of antiques that Linda and I have gotten into just recently, and by the way, it's what year is it? 2016. Yeah. Right now it's 2016 that we're talking about. So some of the hobbies that Linda and I have picked up is cooking with cast iron cookware, which brings back memories to me because some of them were ones that were particularly cast iron kettles, and frying pans, griddles that were used by my grandparents and my mother. I've given some of them away to some of my grandchildren. I remember one particularly I've given to Paula, and a kettle that was used by a grandmother, and I'm going to give a bunch of tools that were used by my grandfathers to Sven Eric, and I know he says he's really going to enjoy them and enjoying something that a grandparent has actually worked with, and that he will get an opportunity to do.
What did your grandfather do?
And since I've just mentioned my grandfather, he did a lot of woodwork, but primarily he was he was a stonemason when he came from Sweden, but he also worked in the leather industry. I'm not sure what he did there, but I know I have some of his leatherworking tools at home, and I'll make sure that they go on to Sven. Things to Paul also are there. Some lamps there, and also from my grandfather's, Porfor's home, is a couple of beautiful lamps, still kerosene lamps, and then along with that are some lamps that I remember. There's one lamp there that was the lamp, or two lamps that were the lamps that we got when Sonia was born, because the power was off and it was cold in our house in Shelton, Washington, and so the doctors or nurses at the hospital said we had to have some lamps there so that we could see what we were doing. So we've got two nice lamps from that day, but a really nice lamp from my father's mother, and that's one that we want to keep and pass it on, along with other things. Well, like I say, we're learning how to cook with cast iron cookware, and we're having a lot of fun with it. And Linda really moves into it and creates some. Yesterday morning we had what was it? We had blueberry scones. Yes, my favorite one to make is Swedish pancakes, svenskplättar, and I can make those. I've learned from my mother. I still use my mother's recipe for those. One recipe she brought from her mother, and I enjoy making those. And Linda's grandchildren want to come over to our house in the morning to have Swedish pancakes, where you roll them up like a hot dog and put maple syrup or sugar and butter on them and just eat them like they're going out of style. When I started college, I started at the University of Maine, as I mentioned earlier, in wildlife and forestry, because I from the time I'd been in high school, I'd been thinking of being a forest ranger. And so that was one of my goals for the time there. As I said, I went to the University of Maine, had a great time, and had some great professors that taught me many things that I would need to know in later life. When I was at the University of Maine, I had made some fine friends at my fraternity, Lambda Chi Alpha. Particularly one I remember was Art Allen from Brewer, Maine. And he and I did a lot of things together, including the story I told about taking photos of an osprey. We also hunted some ducks down along the coast of Maine. Had a great time doing that. Then some of the other things while at the university, what I enjoyed doing was getting out and about in the Maine countryside, particularly in the winter. I enjoyed snowshoeing. That was a lot of fun. That was almost a fun sport. Not only cruising timber, but it was a fun sport. We also when there. Oh, but after that, when I went on to, I mentioned learning to cook with from my mother to some extent. Not a lot, but just necessary things to do in our household. Since my grandmother in Fenimore, why she moved in with us with my mother and father, she brought a lot of ideas from Sweden and skills. She had learned to do I think it was in their school system over in Sweden, there were a lot of things for girls particularly to learn how to do when they were growing up. Cooking and sewing and knitting, things like that. That was a standard thing that was taught over in Sweden. And my grandmother brought a lot of those skills with her. She enjoyed making quilts and all kinds of, I think it was needlework, I don't know the name particularly, but she did many things that into tapestries that I still have and have enjoyed them, particularly ones that were designed to be used or shown at Christmas time. And I still have them, and I'd love to have my children and grandchildren become familiar with them. Not that they're going to pick up those habits, but they were good ones, along with cooking that I've mentioned earlier. Oh, and one of the things that I think about too that I have collected over the years is copper tea kettles, and I have a very interesting collection of copper tea kettles, and I'm going to pass those on to my grandchildren, and hopefully they'll pass them on from there. At the University of Maine, why I met a young lady there that I went out with several times and got to meet her parent, her mother at least. I never met her father, but we went out quite a few times together and went to some fraternity parties and enjoyed them, enjoyed sitting around with other young people, and eventually we decided to get married. Her name was Linda Todd. She came from Caribou, Maine, and we were eventually married and enjoyed it. We have 3 children. We have Paula, Sven, and
Sonia.
Sonia. That's one of the things that happens too when you start having Alzheimer's disease, but I'll talk about that later. So we had those 3 children. Paula lives over in Tillamook, Oregon. Sven lives in Salem, Oregon with his wife Gloria. Paula's wife is Tony, and their grandson